everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel and happy Friday. I hope you've all had a good week and that you have a wonderful weekend ahead of you. I thought today that I'd share some of the books that I've read this week. It's always a bit frustrating that I find that I read a lot of books, but sometimes it's hard to share them with all of you in the moment, so to speak. And although I might not be able to do this every week because of other videos that I want to share, I'm hoping to be able to do these a lot more regularly, so you have an idea of the books that I'm reading and also buying and getting more on a sort of week by week basis, because that way too I remember what I'm reading and it's not so hard to try and share everything all at once at the end of the month sometimes. So I have a few books that I've read this week that I'll be sharing with you, and then some books I've been looking at and some that arrived in the post. So do get a cup of tea and get cozy, and I can't wait to share these amazing books with you. First of all, I've actually read 3 novels by E.M. Delafield this week. And if you're a member of my Comfort Book Club, then you'll know that Diary of a Provincial Lady by E.M. Delafield is the November book club pick. So obviously I'm going to be rereading that one, but I also wanted to dive into some of her other novels this month as I was really inspired. Some of her work I have read before, but I want to reread, and then some of her novels I've never read, and she actually wrote a lot. She was really astoundingly prolific, so there's no way I'm going to be able to read all of her books, but there are some that I'm particularly interested in. So the first one I want to share with you, because I think it's most relevant to the book club, is The Way Things Are by E.M. Delafield. This one I read a long time ago and I wanted to reread it because this was a novel of hers that she wrote before The Diary of a Provincial Lady. But it definitely inspired her series of Diary of a Provincial Lady, which originally appeared in a magazine. And The Way Things Are is absolutely hilarious. I really recommend reading it for anyone who enjoys Diary of a Provincial Lady. It is darker, and this is why for a comfort book club I would certainly choose Provincial Lady over The Way Things Are. Also, very sadly, this is out of print. You can see I have the old Virago edition, and I really wish they would bring this back in print because it's such a good book. And although it is a bit darker, less of a comfort read, it is so worthwhile reading. E.M. Delafield was an incredible writer. I think she was so talented. She had the most amazing ear for dialogue. Apparently she had the kind of memory where conversations that she'd heard even years and years ago, she could remember, and she could just really capture the way that people spoke at this time. And you really get that from reading her novels. Her dialogue is one of her strongest points as a writer, and that really comes out in this book. But she's also marvellous at domestic detail of the period. This book, I think it was originally published, let me check, 1927, so late 1920s, and you get so much detail here about how a household, but sort of a upper middle class British family, how that sort of household would have been run. So this is a lot like A Diary of a Provincial Lady in that it's about a rather dissatisfied housewife, a woman named Laura Temple. She's about 34 years old, I think, in this book. She's lost her sort of first bloom, but she's the wife of 2 young sons, one of whom she has to admit to herself she actually loves more than the other. She definitely has a very favourite child. She considers herself to be fairly happily married, but the reality is that her marriage doesn't fulfill her in any sort of way. She has no real emotional attachment to her husband, who is described as quite a dull and in some ways rather a domineering personality. They've been married for about 7 years and they just no longer have anything to say to each other. He routinely falls asleep behind his newspaper in the evenings. She desperately thinks of interesting things to say and can only come up with what the children have been doing that day, or how is she going to find a new cook, for instance. So her life feels very small and narrow. She tries to eke out their rather inadequate income by writing little stories on the side that she sells to magazines, but Laura doesn't really think of herself as a proper writer. She has no confidence in herself, and generally she spends her days feeling inadequate and really not enjoying the domestic duties that are such a chore to her every day. But then one day, her sister introduces her to a man who falls instantly in love with Laura. And his name is Duke Island, or Ayland, I'm not quite sure how you say the last name. But she also ends up falling in love with him. Why she really falls in love with him is because he's about the only man she's ever known who actually cares about Laura, asks how she is, seems interested in her, encourages her writing, and actually just wants to talk to her about herself, and who isn't frightened of having an emotional connection. Now, this book, I'm sure when you read it, will remind you of Brief Encounter, which is a marvellous film. If you've never seen it, you must. And there's a reason it will remind you of Brief Encounter. And that is that I think Noel Coward was apparently inspired by this book when he wrote his one-act play, Still Life. And that was the play that inspired the screenplay, also written by Noel Coward, of Brief Encounter. So this book, like Brief Encounter, is about a sort of doomed love affair between a married woman and another man. But E.M. Delafield is incredibly funny. I mean, although there is more of a melancholy air to this book than something like Diary of a Provincial Lady, there is still so much humour. There are just laugh out loud funny comic moments that just really lighten the mood of the novel, and that's why I love it so much. It's deeply profound, but it's also incredibly funny, and to have a writer who's able to do that, I think, is just extraordinary. And I wanted to share a little scene from this with you. E.M. Delafield, there's a lot of satire in this novel, and I think she took a lot of pleasure in poking fun at the types of writers who say that they need absolute stillness and quiet and ideal conditions in order to write. Bear in mind, E.M. Delafield was extremely prolific. She was an incredibly hard worker. She had a lot of duties in the village in Devon that she undertook. With the Women's Institute, she was a magistrate, she was a mother, a wife, she ran a household. With all of this chaos going on around her, she managed to keep writing, churning out novels, works of journalism, just so much all of the time. She could not indulge in any whims of how she wrote, so bear that in mind when I read this to you. This is taking place at a little gathering of writers at a house in Highgate. And one of the characters is talking about an author who recently visited them. "He came to us for a little while," said Mrs. Onslow, shaking her head. "I thought perhaps that if he had perfect quiet, and a room overlooking the river, and his meals, of course, whenever he could manage them, he doesn't touch anything except black coffee and stewed figs, he might be able to work. But he couldn't. He used to come down in the evenings looking ghastly and say that he'd been in hell." Laura instinctively glanced round the table, wondering if her own inclination to comment flippantly upon so poor a recognition of hospitality was out of place. She could not doubt that it was. Bebe was looking soulfully at her host, but every other face wore an expression of concern for the difficulties that had momentarily overcome genius. A lady in round, tortoiseshell-rimmed spectacles spoke from the other side of the table. "I prefer to write, or rather dictate, in bed. Many people I know find bed quite impossible, but I'm strong, you know." Mrs. Anslow made a sympathetic sound of corroboration. "My wretched back won't let me sit up for long, so I simply stay there until lunchtime every day and dictate for 2.5 hours, sometimes more." "Wonderful," said another lady, whom Laura had thought of as wealthy rather than talented, owing to her clothes and the fabulous size of her pearls. "I need complete silence and isolation. I often think of poor Carlyle and his sound-proof room, and I've come to the conclusion that there is no such thing. I have a bungalow on the Sussex Downs, you know, to which I retire whenever I write, but even there I'm sent nearly mad. A dog barks, or there's a fly buzzing in the room. Never absolute silence." "Leave England," advised her neighbour, a fair man with enormous and prominent eyes, an enormous and prominent Adam's apple, in whom Laura thought that she recognised a reasonably well-known poet. "Leave England. It's the only thing to do. I was 6 months in the Sahara last year." Laura's head was reeling slightly. Evidently, she thought, none of these talented people were bound by any domestic ties whatsoever. The lady who was sent nearly mad by the bark of a dog and the buzz of a fly could never have produced a Johnny or an Edward, and subjected her reason to the far greater strain of existence in their neighbourhood. So, a lot of E.M. Delafield's novels are definitely quite autobiographical, and in Laura Temple, the heroine in this book, you definitely see quite a bit of E.M. Delafield herself. But that gives you a little bit of an idea of the wonderful wit in her writing, and I so recommend reading this if you can find a copy for yourselves. Then I also read this novel for the first time, Thank Heaven Fasting, by E.M. Delafield. This, I think, is one of her most melancholy books. It's set, well, actually, it doesn't really give a time period in which it's set, but I think you're definitely meant to assume that it's Edwardian society. And it's about a young girl who is just about to come out in that society. There's a very apt quote that they put on the back, and that comes very early on in the novel. This young girl, Monica, is reflecting that she could never, looking backwards, remember a time when she had not known that a woman's failure or success in life depended entirely upon whether or not she succeeded in getting a husband. So Monica Ingram is just launched into fashionable Edwardian society of London, and her sole purpose is in getting a suitable husband. Both her mother and father have given her to understand that there really is no other option. And if she doesn't succeed in that, then she will definitely be shamed and become quite an outcast within her own society. She sees an example of that in two young women who she's been friends with all of her life, essentially. They're sisters, Frederica and Cecily Marlowe, and they were absolute disasters in their own coming out and have been very much left on the shelf. Their mother openly ridicules her daughters, and Monica lives in horror and fear that this will happen to her. But at her coming out ball, she seems to be a success, and she is very excited to feel that she is in fact attractive to men and that she should be able to secure a husband. Then disaster hits when she falls in love with the wrong man, a real rake, who manages to destroy Monica's reputation and leave her broken-hearted. This book is divided into 3 parts. There's the first part that concerns Monica's coming out. The second part is called The Difficult Years, and it's in these years that we see Monica lose all her confidence in herself after being so betrayed and feeling that she made an utter mistake, is a complete failure, and is never going to be able to marry. In these years, she gets more and more and more desperate. Then the third part of the book is called The Happy Ending. And at the end of the book, Monica does, in fact, receive a proposal of marriage, which comes as such a relief to her. She is joyful about it, but the reader's joy in this ending is much more subdued. The book ends at the actual marriage altar, and it's the reader who is aware of what is coming next for Monica in her married life. And it's really one of the most heart-rending books. It gives you such a flavour of what a young woman like Monica, living in Edwardian times, in upper-class society, her life was just so narrow, so few choices. All she was meant to do was be successful in securing a marriage. And I think that E.M. Delafield, again, you get some of her lightness of touch, some of her humour comes through this, but this is also one of the most poignant and sad novels. And what happens to Monica's friends, Frederica and Cecily, is also quite haunting. It really haunts the reader, their story as well. But again, you get this wonderful insight into all of the details of a household at that moment in history, how it was run. There's amazing detail given as to clothes. Again, the dialogue is brilliant too, and you get this sense of how people really spoke as well as what they thought about. There are references made to women wanting the vote, and they're always spoken of incredibly scathingly by Mrs. Ingram, Monica's mother, and all of her acquaintances. You realise that although Monica was aware at the sort of periphery of her awareness that maybe there were other choices for women, she was very much brought up and taught to think that that wasn't in fact the case, not for her. E.M. Delafield very much wanted to write about characters that were neither wholly good nor wholly bad. So Monica isn't perhaps a typical heroine in that she doesn't rebel against her parents, she doesn't stand up for herself, she doesn't carve out a different way of life. She very much follows in her mother's footsteps. She does what her parents want her to, and her sole ambition in life is to get married. But you can see why that happens, why she was brought up with this knowledge, and that she was a very typical woman of her time. And it just is a really interesting book to read, very slim, and another one that I really enjoyed reading this week and really recommend. And then the final Delafield I read is Tension, which has just fairly recently been brought out. It's part of the British Library Women Writers series. This one was quite a different novel from all of the rest of them. It's about, well, the tension that the title refers to is about an atmosphere that is created when a relatively young, not that young, but still relatively young woman arrives in a sort of Devonshire society in a small town to teach at the college. And Lady Rossiter, the sort of aristocrat of the neighbourhood, has a real interest in this college. When she learns from her husband, who is president of the college, that this young woman has arrived to fulfill a new post, she recognises her name, Miss Martrose, and she thinks that this Miss Martrose must be the same Miss Martrose that jilted a cousin of Lady Rossiter's. Lady Rossiter becomes increasingly jealous of Miss Martrose when she notices a closeness between her and a young man called Mark, who is one of their neighbours in Devon. This man is in fact married, but his wife is an alcoholic and has been sent off to a home for alcoholics, leaving her husband and their children. Lady Rossiter is very interested in Mark, and she likes to consider herself really the only real woman in his life. So when Miss Marchrose makes an appearance and evidently grows closer to Mark, Lady Rossiter takes action, and she sets about spreading rumours about Miss Marchrose and her past. Now, this is an interesting book in that although Miss Marchrose is the more typical heroine, the book really focuses on Lady Rossiter, Edna Rossiter. And she is the type of character that you just love to hate. She is completely oblivious to a lot of her own motivations and her personality. She is full of trite phrases that give her the moral high ground. For instance, she always sort of says to herself and to others, is it true, is it kind, is it wise, before she'll say anything. So she believes that she's a very moral person, she would never speak badly of anyone, and yet she manages to destroy a young woman's reputation and her possible chances at happiness. So she is a real hypocrite. And Lady Rossiter has a very unhappy marriage with her husband Julian, who sees all of his wife's hypocrisies, and neither of them are in love with each other. This book is again unusual from the other novels that I've read by E.M. Delafield, because so much of the female characters are actually perceived through the male gaze. You see Miss Marchrose really only through the eyes of Julian Rossiter, and you don't get any access to her innermost thoughts. And perceiving her through the male gaze of Sir Julian, he only ever, well, not only ever, but he mainly describes her in terms of her appearance, how attractive or not she is looking on that day. And that's quite unusual for E.M. Delafield, in that in general you see women through the eyes of other women much more. All of her novels do tend to deal with unhappy marriages, and that really is at the centre of this novel too. The tension, I think, also refers to the situation between Lady Rossiter and her husband. You feel that this, the atmosphere between them, although it never comes to breaking point, because Sir Julian really always opts for the quiet life instead. He won't stand up to his wife. But you feel the tension in the home surrounding them as a result of their real dislike in the end of each other. There are other characters that provide a lot of comedy in this book. There are two young children, Mark Easter's children, and they're just so well drawn. I mean, they're the most frightful children, and the only times that Edna Rossiter and her husband bond is when they're just both appalled by these children that have a tendency to just turn up unannounced at their home. And it's absolutely hilarious. There are some really, really funny scenes in this book. Now, there are a couple of marriages, one that takes place in this book, one that is about to take place at the end. But as always with E.M. Delafield, you're left wondering how those marriages are going to turn out. Anyway, I so enjoyed this as well and highly recommend it. And then I also finished reading Peggy of the Chalet School this week. This is a new publication by Girls Gone By publishers. I loved the Chalet School books when I was little. I collected them all in hardbacks, but Now I'm so thrilled to have The Girls Gone By paperbacks. They reprint the original first editions, so they're sort of complete and unabridged editions. Peggy of the Chalet School was always one of my favourites. It's about young Peggy Bettany, who on her return to the Chalet School is unexpectedly made head girl. And she has some trials to get through during her first term as head girl. There's terrible weather, and in this part of the series, the Chalet School is placed on a little island just off the coast of Wales, and her beloved Aunt Jo is almost shipwrecked when she comes over to try to teach history. There's a girl who's jealous of Peggy, and she has to overcome all sorts of trials and tribulations essentially in her first term. But it's just such a sweet story. I love the Chalet School books for the sense of kind of comfort that they give me rereading them as an adult. And at the end there's a new short story. I can't remember who wrote it, let me check, but it's called Primula and the Prefect's Room. It's by Helen Barber, and she wrote this short story specifically for this new edition. It's a very sweet short story that has a real Christmassy feel to it too, so reading it really put me in a festive mood, and that was lovely. And then some books that arrived this week that I'm really excited about. First up is this beautiful, beautiful book, Edinburgh, by Robert Louis Stevenson. It's by Manderley Press. I'll show you the back as well, so you can see that. Which is a new publishing company, and Manderley Press, this is their first publication, and they very kindly sent me a press copy. I think it's gorgeous. There's new original artwork done for it, and an introduction written by Alexander McCall Smith. And Robert Louis Stevenson first wrote this guide to Edinburgh 150 years ago, but it still looks like it will be a wonderful read and give an amazing insight into the city. Edinburgh is so beautiful. I've been there once and I really want to go back, and it'll be so fun to read this. There are some lovely chapter illustrations too, with each chapter heading there's a little illustration, and I love that. I love getting illustrations in books, so I think that's really special. But the whole thing is just a work of art. I'm so impressed by this. Often with tiny publishers, they just can't quite afford the real sort of quality of producing a hardback like this, so I'm so impressed. There's a lovely cloth binding on the spine, then the original artwork. You can also buy this artwork as a poster or as a card, which Manderley Press also very kindly sent me the little card, which I think is wonderful. But the idea behind Manderley Press is that they republish forgotten books that have a strong sense of place. And apparently they'll be doing both fiction and non-fiction, including children's books, but all of the books will focus on this idea of having a really strong sense of place. So whether they're city guides or perhaps novels, but novels based on a particular home, for instance, that's the general idea, and that sounds right up my street, so I can't wait to see what else Manderley Press are going to publish. I'm just really, really impressed by this first one. I think it's gorgeous, so I was thrilled to get that. Then I had another book arrive in the post this week, which was very appropriate actually, considering that Armistice Day fell this week, and that's The Tears of War, the love story of a young poet and a war hero. The war hero was Bevel Quiller Couch, and the young poet was May Cannon. Now, after rereading 84 Charing Cross Road for the Comfort Book Club in October, I got really interested in finding out a little bit more about Sir Arthur Quiller Couch, or known as Q. Helen Hanff always called him Q. And it was his book that she got out from the library that was full of lectures that he'd given to Oxbridge students that inspired her to educate herself through books, to write off to London and to order books. So 84 Charing Cross Road would never have been written if it weren't for Q. And that's what Helen Hanff also explains in her memoir, Q's Legacy, which I absolutely loved. But anyway, in reading a bit more about Q, I read that he had a son, Bevel, who died during the First World War, and that this son had been engaged to May Cannon. Now, May Cannon was the sister of Joanna Cannon. Joanna Cannon was the mother of the Pullen-Thompson sisters, who wrote so many amazing pony books that I adored when I was young and I still love now. Joanna Cannon was a writer herself. She wrote a lot of pony books for children too, but she also wrote some novels for adults and some mysteries for adults too. One of her books has actually been republished by Persephone Books. I just love it when I discover these sorts of literary ties and links that I never suspected, and you can just sort of go down this rabbit hole and find all of these literary connections. Anyway, I also heard about this book, The Tears of War, and it tells the story of, it tells the love story, as it says, between May Cannon and Bevel Quiller Couch. And it's a very touching story, obviously quite a tragic one too. And May Cannon wrote some beautiful poetry. She married in later life, and the man who married her first contacted her because of his love for her poetry, and that sort of became a bond between them, and she ended up marrying him. But then when later in life she wrote a novel that was very much inspired by her romance with Bevel, her then husband couldn't tolerate any sort of mention of the book. It was clear to her that he hated it, couldn't read it, and in fact had become very jealous of her writing. And sadly, that whole experience made her stop writing. She maybe scribbled a few more verses, but that was really it. So that story of a marriage somehow links in my mind so much the marriages that are described by E.M. Delafield. And like I said, it's just amazing when one thing you read sort of leads to another, and I really do want to read this. I'm looking forward to dipping into it, hopefully over the weekend. But anyway, those are the books that I've been reading and getting and feeling inspired by this week. I hope you've enjoyed this, and I've enjoyed being able to tell you about these books in a bit more detail, so I hope that you've enjoyed that as well. And I would like to hopefully keep going with this as a little series and telling you about what I'm reading and getting on a bit more of a week by week basis. So I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Do give this a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you could subscribe to my channel by clicking on my face that pops up on the screen. But have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you again soon. Goodbye.